So instead of looking for the slickness that professional image makers have taught us to believe is truth, look instead and listen to a video that does not attempt to form your thoughts and control your thinking. This is a video that provokes your thought. It asks the unaskable questions and does not take governmental answers as gospel. So if your answer is no, I am in doubt about a man on the moon, then here is some of the evidence that you may wonder about. And for you who say, yes, I saw the moonwalk on TV, we simply ask that you suspend your annoyance with our improper questions while you see this video to its conclusion.
President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters, which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year. But we are behind.
If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about U.S. military readiness during the Cold War. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true?
Casing theorizes that the lunar landings were actually filmed in Nevada's high desert, at the top secret military base known as Area 51.
Area 51 is one of the most heavily guarded facilities in the United States. If you went in and tried to get some information, you could be shot and killed without any warning.
Russian spy satellite photos of Area 51 reveal not only a series of hangars that resemble movie sound stages, but also barren moon-like areas which coincidentally are covered with craters. Compare this photo of a lunar crater allegedly taken from the moon's orbit by Apollo 10 with this satellite photo of a crater at Area 51. Even astronauts acknowledge the similarity of the terrain.
It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States.
As the sheer magnitude of achieving such a task without being discovered or denounced would appear to be beyond the bounds of possibility, most people are quick to laugh this hypothesis off as an example of conspiracy theory run amok. Yet before we dismiss it so readily, let's remember that it's initially easier to dismiss outrageous ideas even if they should eventually be proven correct. Simply because we might not want to face up to uncomfortable truths.
The view of co-author Mary Bennett and myself is that these whistleblowers were individuals deeply unhappy with the fraud they were perpetrating. They in all likelihood created the errors in the anticipation that one day these mistakes would be discovered and exposed.
And even in some pictures, the Earth is about the size of the Moon, which it should have been at least 4 times bigger.
With his experiences at Rocketdyne, made him a skeptic.
The whole thing then seemed phony to me. I think it was an intuitive feeling that what was being shown was not real.
As he studied the footage more closely, he was shocked to find several inconsistencies. Casing observed that despite the clarity of deep space, the stars were missing from the black lunar sky. He saw the American flag waving, even though there is no air on the moon. And he discovered that there was no blast crater beneath the lunar lander, where its powerful rocket engine had fired. This evidence convinced Casing that we never sent a man to the moon. But NASA dismisses these charges.
There are always going to be people who believe some outlandish theories, and the notion that we somehow were able to fake the lunar missions is pretty outlandish.
Our research suggests that images of the Apollo landings are not a true and accurate record. In our view, the Apollo pictures were faked. Many of the images are replete with inconsistencies and anomalies.
In fact, Percy claims that when examined, these images suggest that man never went to the moon at all. This famous scene of man taking his first step on the lunar surface is one of the most recognizable in history. But why are such important images so grainy and hard to see?
And we're getting a picture on the TV. You had a good picture, huh?
NASA claims it's the result of 1960s technology.
But if you go back and look at it, the Apollo 11 mission was some pretty awful video by today's standards. These were ghostly images. It just did not look very real at all. And that was a function of the transmitter at the time, the camera at the time that we had available to us to fly on Apollo 11.
But investigative journalist Bart Sabrell believes that NASA intentionally made the images hard to see.
NASA orchestrated the hoax in a very unique way through television. They had one picture which they completely controlled, black and white, grainy, that convinced everybody we were on the moon. We had no reason to doubt it. They had complete reins over the pictures, over the sound. I mean, sad to say, it was easier than people believe.
But despite the lack of clarity, conspiracy theorists see evidence suggesting that these images were staged.
It's absolutely unreal.
Although it appears that the astronauts are moving in the moon's gravity, which is 1/6 that of the Earth, Percy notes that when the speed of the film is doubled, the astronauts appear to be running as if in Earth's gravity. Also, when the footage of the lunar rover is doubled in speed, it looks as if it's driving here on Earth. But there's another reason some believe the Apollo missions were shot on Earth. If there is no air or wind on the moon, why is this American flag waving?
The fact that the flag flaps on the moon where there's no atmosphere means that there must have been a little blast of wind out in Area 51 where they shot this.
Could these questionable images simply be the result of astronauts struggling to plant the flag into the lunar surface? Case in point, on the moon, the astronauts' only source of light was the sun.
They had no extra lighting, no flashes, no things like that.
Yet in this photograph from Apollo 14, the shadows are cast in different directions, suggesting multiple light sources.
The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadow.
And in this photo from Apollo 17, again the shadows are pointing in different directions.
Outside in sunlight, shadows always run parallel with one another. So the shadows will never intersect.
Conspiracy theorists say it's not just the shadows that indicate the use of additional lights, but what has been photographed in the shadows. For example, here's an astronaut who descends into a huge shadow cast by the lunar module. Yet his entire body is still visible. How is it that he is not shrouded in darkness? Here's the same maneuver from another Apollo mission. Again, the astronaut is brightly lit in what is obviously dark shadow. And in this picture, the sun is directly behind the astronaut. His figure should be a silhouette. Yet even the smallest characteristics of his suit are recognizable.
It seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why?
And finally, in this picture with the sun behind the lunar module, the front of the craft is clearly visible. The words United States are crisp and clear. How could these backlit pictures be so detailed?
It's because there's more than one light source, which means they're not on the moon.
But NASA simply dismisses these arguments.
There are a number of claims that the pictures taken by Apollo astronauts were faked. And there are so many, it would be an exercise in futility to go off and try to answer all of those.
But the questions continue. Why do some of these images shot at different times and different places appear to have identical backgrounds? These two photos seem to have the same mountain backdrop, yet the lunar module is only present in one of them. Seemingly impossible, since the LEM never moved and its base remained even after the mission.
This is the designated landing site of Apollo 14. The area where the LEM is located is virtually flat. But one can calculate from the diverging shadows that the source of the illumination is within the area of the scene itself, apparently overhead. In other words, it cannot be the sun. It's possible to work out exactly where the light source was positioned, because the shadows diverge from a point here, when in fact the shadows ought to be parallel. The sun creates parallel shadows. The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadow here. When natural sunlight is illuminating objects on flat terrain, this result is impossible, but this result is consistent with illumination from a closely positioned artificial source of light.
Should we then take this matter of artificial lighting very seriously?
Yes, because according to the official record, no artificial lighting whatsoever was taken to the moon. Compare NASA's photograph with our computer-simulated image. The light source, the sun, in our simulation is located far to the west, the left-hand side of your screen. And in our illustration, all the shadows are falling, naturally, due east. We must therefore irrefutably conclude that an artificial light source was used in close proximity to this alleged moon location in order for NASA to obtain the non-parallel shadows seen here in this photograph. Let's go through some more examples. Here is a Honda press advertisement that's used a very interesting mix of shadow directions. For the sake of argument, let us take it that the cars were the primary subject of the photograph, so they were the beneficiaries of the prime source of natural light, the sun, and the very, very short shadows created by the cars themselves indicate that these were photographed near to midday. The sun's direction is from the bottom right-hand corner, The palm trees, however, have been photographed when the sun was further round, nearer to setting, and therefore creating these very long shadows due to the sun's closeness to the horizon. This is an example of a composite picture, containing two differing sets of shadows. A composite that incorporates the message that there have been time delays between the components that make up the final result. The rock with the letter C marked on it, originally noticed by fellow researcher Raoul. Let's pause here for a moment and ask why there should be a letter of the English alphabet stamped onto a rock on the moon's surface, and why there's a C also marked on the ground just in front of this very peculiar looking rock. How could this be? Surely we're looking at the deliberate planting of props on a previously designated portion in the foreground of a photographic film set. Here we have the sun, allegedly the only lighting source available to all lunar photographers, directly behind the astronaut and directly behind the rover. And remembering our example of the Mongolian herdsman, with no extra lighting and no atmosphere to help diffuse the light and fill in the subject, we must expect the authentic lunar surface picture to look like this, with both the astronaut and the rover in silhouette. Yet in this NASA moon photograph, as published, we can see detail on the shadow side of the astronaut. To say this once more, such detail can only be revealed by the use of an additional light source. So we have to conclude that secondary lighting was used to create these alleged lunar surface pictures.
Were any lights used in the lunar surface photographs?
No. They had no extra light sources brought with them.
If you magnify the photograph and look at the boundary of the porch through which the astronaut is exiting, you can see a fine shadow line around the porch perimeter. This shadow line shows that you have a well-localized source of light to the right of the camera. Most interestingly, there is a hot spot on the heel protector of the astronaut's right-hand boot. This allows us to do some quantitative measurement. We had access to one of these boots with a heel protector from which we could measure very accurately the curvature of that heel protector. Knowing again the focal length of the camera lens, the position of that hotspot on the heel protector and the orientation of the boot in the photograph, we could determine the light path to that source of illumination. The light source is between 24 and 36 centimeters to the right of the camera, an ideal position for artificial lighting.
Confirmation that wires were used is in the detail. Here in this Apollo 14 footage, you can see a ping, a momentary glint. This one is from Apollo 17 during the flag scene. You can see the ping at the top of the frame.
Perhaps the Apollo space program would be better titled The Sound and Light Show, for what we actually hear or don't hear on the soundtracks is often inconsistent with both physics and the facts as presented to us. Just listen to this soundtrack as a bobsleigh team races down the famous Samaritz Bob Run. You can hear the pilot announcing the names of the corners they're negotiating.
That is the Cold War. Maxwell, the Snake 1 and Snake 2. And now is Sunny. Nash and Dixon. And then is coming Horseshoe. Telephone. Shatterock. 3.
This is hugely exciting to listen to. We feel that we're virtually inside the bobsleigh with the team. Yet while this sport is no doubt enjoyable for the participants, it's also a highly stressful physical situation. Listening to the bob pilot, we can hear the vibration and the tension engendered by the sheer speed and potential danger of the situation. Now let's listen to the two Apollo 11 astronauts landing on another planet for the first time in history.
Feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. 75 feet, that's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 30 seconds.
I don't really know and haven't even bothered to go find out. And the reason is, this is 30-year-old stuff. We mounted this expedition, the expeditions to the moon, almost 30 years ago. And frankly, I had a chance to look over the points that this person was making. I didn't understand them. I don't understand why we should spend the time to go off and do the research to look up, to prove to people that we went to the moon. The fact of the matter is we did go to the moon.
While noting that Brian Welch referred to one single expedition to the moon and then corrected himself, it's interesting that NASA, via its media representative, declares itself not accountable to the public for its actions. This despite the fact that NASA went to the moon for all mankind. And surely the fact that one individual spokesman claims he doesn't understand the questions asked does not in any way invalidate the demand for a proper response and the necessity for a proper response.
The effort involved in trying to fake, one image might not be too bad, but in trying to fake thousands and thousands to assure that you were never discovered over 25 years seems completely implausible to me. It seems a bizarre thing to question something that is so demonstrably part of history just by trying to interpret 2 or 3 photographs when the project was so much deeper than that and affected so many people in so many ways.
This establishment view, albeit not held by everyone, misses the point entirely and is not a reason for ignoring these disturbing findings. The quantity of suspect pictures is not the real issue, it's what these images convey. These pictures have been presented to the entire world as authentic and actual photographs of this most significant event, mankind's first steps onto a planet other than his home. To ignore or dismiss the questions raised by the discovery of even one technically defective photograph purporting to be a part of this official record is to sidestep the issue.
Some people say that in 1969 people were incapable of sending a man to the moon, but that they were capable of staging the whole thing in a TV studio. In fact, the opposite is true. By the late 1960s, they did have the technical ability, not to mention the requisite madness, to send 3 guys to the moon and back. They did not have the technology to fake it on video. Some people get a lot of attention by pointing out flaws in the photographic evidence from Apollo. When you listen to them, they seem not to know very much about photography or video or lighting or even perspective, and I think they're hoping you don't either.
And all the astronauts have ever said is they never saw stars. Even when they took pictures of the Earth, there were no stars in the picture, and yet the Earth is reflected light, and the stars should have been bright like headlights of cars, because there's no atmosphere. Sky totally black, but there's no stars.
So we should have seen stars in the sky? No, we shouldn't. The camera was set to expose for broad daylight. If they were exposing for stars, then this picture would have looked more like this. Flags waving in the breeze? No, it isn't. It's wiggling in the vacuum after they let it go. And the shadows diverge unrealistically across the landscape? No, they don't. Go outside sometime and see how shadows work. They obviously used multiple light sources in this picture, right? No, they obviously didn't. I've been shooting in the studio for about 30 years now. I know what to look for. When you shine 2 lights at something, you get 2 shadows. So this would have looked more like this. But it doesn't, because this stuff was shot with a single light source. And if that light was anywhere near the action, you would have seen a fall off in brightness across the terrain. You don't, because the light source was 150 million kilometers away, too far away for the inverse square law to make a difference. Get it?
A body in motion tends to remain in motion unless stopped, and the only thing that could stop this soil would be atmosphere. And that right there, those waves are where it hits the atmosphere and stops, Frank. I want to know what NASA scientific principle says that that's wrong.
There are 2 ways to make motion slow. One is you shoot it at a normal speed and play it back slow. The other is you shoot it fast and play it back normal. The second way is called overcranking. It looks smoother and more realistic because you're sampling natural motion at a higher frame rate. But that means we would have had to shoot it on film using high-speed film cameras, right? Why? Because in 1969 there were no high-speed video cameras yet. The electronics just weren't there. Some people did have a magnetic disc recorder that could capture normal speed video and play it back slow. They used it for sports replays. It could record up to 30 seconds. play back at 10 FPS, and you've got a whopping 90 seconds of slow-mo. I'm sticking with 10 frames per second because that was the video frame rate for Apollo 11. They had a non-interlaced slow-scan TV camera, especially made for them by Westinghouse. All the later missions were using regular NTSC cameras running at 2997 FPS. That would be 3 times harder to fake. I'm trying to make this easy. Keep in mind that when people today watch documentaries about the Apollo missions, they're looking at the highlights. They're looking at, short clips cut together. And short clips are much easier to fake. But in July 1969, 600 million people, including me, were all staring at a continuous lunar telecast that went on for a long time. It's actually pretty boring sometimes. At 16 minutes into the EVA, they turn on the video camera. 4 minutes later, you get your one small step thing. Then Aldrin climbs out, and they move the camera onto a tripod and proceed to do all their moonwalking, flag planting, photo snapping, and rock picking. Then Armstrong climbs back up into the lander, and it's over. By which time the video camera has been running for 143 minutes. So if we're faking this with electronic slow-mo at 1/3 speed, we only need to record about 47 minutes of continuous live-action video. Well, that's a lot more than that Ampex disc recorder could hold. But NASA is special. Maybe they have a big disc recorder, right, in 1969. Okay, how much bigger? 95 times bigger? I don't know, man. I mean, government agencies are powerful, but they're not God. Then again, they are NASA. Maybe they did have some special way to overcrank video in 1969 for an hour and a half. Maybe they had some top secret high-speed electronics that the rest of the world never knew about. Oh, wait a minute. No, you guys said that their navigation computers were too slow. I guess we can't have it both ways. I mean, it can't be fast and slow at the same time, right?
This appears to be high noon on the moon, 250 degrees in the sun. They should have cooked and baked inside that LEM. And Eastman Kodak told me that film melts at 150 degrees. None of the film taken on the moon at this type of temperature should have survived. It should have been crisp like in an oven and curled and melted.
Violent explosions in the sun called magnetic storms flood space with intense radioactivity.
A magnetic storm will come along, and that can increase the intensity of the radiation belts by maybe 1,000 times above what it was before.
According to Renee, the Apollo 16 mission coincided with one of the sun's most intense storms ever recorded.
Around the rotating sun came this immense flare, the biggest one of the 20th century. It went on for 3 or 4 days. All the while it's slowly rotating around.
Although the effects of radiation are horrific, ranging from hair loss to cancer to death, the solar flares had no adverse effect on the Apollo 16 crew.
It's 250 degrees in the sun on the moon. How could this footstep have clumped the soil and stuck together without moisture?
With aluminium shielding, it's accepted that the minimum requirement is a thickness of 10 centimeters all around the craft. Was there any attempt to provide such protection?
No. The walls of the craft were made as thin and light as possible. The Apollo capsule itself was made unusually thin. In fact, they couldn't even initially carry enough air inside to be the equivalent to sea level air pressure. They ran it at reduced pressure in order to be able to make the walls thinner. And then the LEM and other parts of the craft were all made out of very thin material, very flimsy. Almost no protection at all against solar radiation.
Forgetting the astronauts for a moment, what indeed could this solar radiation do to the images? We know, for example, how X-rays can affect film on Earth, and we know how the photographs of the damaged Chernobyl nuclear power station were badly fogged from radiation.
You have an enormous amount of radiation in space, and potentially it affects film, of course, and of course, as you will well know, its prime effect is on contrast.
We took a latent image recorded on the film of a color test chart and exposed it to 8 MeV X-rays. The lowest radiation dose we applied to the film was 25 rem. The latent image, if it hadn't been subjected to radiation, would look like this: a good quality, high contrast, color, transparency. After exposure to the 25 rem radiation, the image is almost entirely obliterated. This means, in my estimation, a dose as little as 5 rem would seriously undermine the transparency. It would look significantly fogged. It would be a very thin image.
If you look at the results, top quality duplicates, you can see that there appears to be no effect whatsoever. It never got to the stage where I heard, at least, that a film had been badly affected by temperature or the pressure differentiation or radiation.
I would expect to see on the transparencies evidence of small bright dots where a high velocity nuclear particle had impinged on that film. I have no evidence whatsoever that this has occurred. The good place to look for it is on the regions of the film which haven't been exposed in the camera, the black spaces, as it were, between the frames. We're protected on Earth by a nice thick atmosphere, and that combined with the magnetic field keep these ionizing particles away from us, on film of course. In space you're not offered that protection. To prevent an ionizing particle, one of very energetic particles that you get in space, from damaging the film, you would need a significant thickness of lead protecting that film.
The leading astronaut of the day, Gus Grissom, was slated to be the first man to walk on the moon. He was an outspoken man with the highest level of integrity. There was no way he would lie for anyone. He was also an outspoken critic of the dilapidated state of the moon program. Just before he died, he hung a lemon on the capsule and held a press conference in which he pointed out the sad state of the program. On the morning he died, upon having difficulty communicating from the capsule, he angrily asked,
"Hey, how are we gonna get to the moon? We can't talk between 3 buildings."
In 1967, during a plugs-out test in which no engines were even ignited, they had him in a sealed capsule and pressurized it with 100% pure oxygen. A fire erupted, and all 3 astronauts perished. After this grisly incident, no other astronaut dared to criticize the program, and after all these years of lying and making their livings off the fame, none chooses to wreck this acclaimed success for the others by telling the truth. There is strong reason to doubt the fire was accidental. Page 81 of the Apollo 1 Accident Investigation Report issued by the U.S. Congress reveals that prior to the fire, NASA, by their own admission, were very well aware of the respective fires at the Johnsville Navy Air Station and Brooks Air Force Base. The fires in question, as pointed out by author Ralph Renee, were a result of sparks and even static electricity igniting the pure oxygen environments. In spite of these past fatalities, NASA used a 100% oxygen atmosphere in the Apollo 1 spacecraft, arguing that they had done it previously on the Gemini program.
Thomas Ronald Barron was a safety inspector during Apollo 1's construction. After the fire, Barron testified before Congress that the Apollo program was in such disarray that the United States would never make it to the moon. He claimed his opinions made him a target.
Has there been any pressure on you by NASA? Nothing. We were, my wife and I were somewhat harassed at home when this first thing broke some time back, but it's gone away now.
As part of his testimony, Barron submitted a 500-page report detailing his findings.
There was a real fear that the program could be stopped dead in its tracks.
Then exactly 1 week after he testified, Barron's car was struck by a train. Barron, his wife, and stepdaughter were killed instantly.
I believe that Thomas Ronald Barron was murdered because he had the truth to tell about the Apollo project.
There were probably 250,000 people who were directly involved in the Apollo program, and another 500,000 people beyond that. 750,000 people can't keep a secret like that. That's just not going to happen.
But Bart Sabrell insists that most NASA employees knew nothing of the deception.
Very few people at NASA knew. The thing is so departmentalized. You got the person building the bolts in Houston, or doing this in Seattle, or doing this in Florida. No one knows the full picture. So, you know, you had no one seeing the full picture of anything except a handful of people.
So I went to investigate the LEM, that strange contraption that supposedly landed them on the moon. It never flew on Earth. Frank, it never flew on Earth. So I said, well, who invented this thing? I went to Grumman Aircraft. And they're in Bethpage, Long Island, and I said, give me all the material that showed how this was developed. What thought went into it? And so when it crashed on Earth and never flew once, I said to myself, why would the astronauts' wives let them go to the moon and test it out there? I mean, you'd have to be wacko to do that. And a funny thing happened, Frank. They told me all the paperwork had been destroyed, that all they had was some PR pieces, a couple of photos, you know, not even photos, they had drawings. I found that incredible. You spent $30 billion to go to the moon, and all the paperwork's been flushed down the toilet. So I went to the archives in Washington, and I went to the archives at NASA, and I went to you. There's no paperwork. The man who invented the LEM should have won the Nobel Prize. His paperwork on what made him think this would work should be in every museum that NASA has, but it's nowhere.
Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong, the greatest achievement in human history, and of the man whose first step echoed around the world, dawning a new age of scientific enlightenment. There is only one full-body picture of him on the moon, besides this ghostly reflection. This one, taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. Perhaps he has forgotten that he attested to the authenticity of the event with his signature on this plaque engraved by the federal government. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever. NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career? All three Apollo 11 astronauts also resigned shortly after their return.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief. Mr. Armstrong, Bart Sibrel, ABC Digital. Wanted to give you the opportunity to swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon. Will you put your left hand on the Bible and swear to God that you walked on the moon?
Gentlemen. Mr. Sibrel.
Yes? If you really walked on the moon, why would you not do that? So why don't you just put the end to the record in the argument and put your hand on the Bible, swear to God you walked on the moon.
Mr. Sibrel, knowing you, that's probably a fake Bible.
The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going?
The total costs of Project Apollo, together with the Soviet part of the program, were estimated to be at least $30 to $40 billion on each side. Now, given this cost, it's perhaps understandable that what we were shown was done so as to avoid the risk of these huge levels of funding not being made available in the first place. And much illusion, including the space race itself, had to be maintained to keep the funds flowing.
Of course, we know at a very high level the Russians and the Americans have been in bed together for a long time. I mean, the Russian Revolution was financed by Wall Street. I mean, this is known.
Beginning October 18, Soviet cosmonauts Andrei Nikolaev and Vitaly Sevastyanov toured the U.S. and several NASA field centers. During that same month, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to study ways that American and Russian spaceships could meet and join in space.
During his visit to Russia, President Nixon signed an agreement with Chairman Kosygin of the USSR to conduct an Earth orbital rendezvous and docking in 1975 between a U.S. and a Russian spacecraft. Engineers from both countries have already begun working out the details of the mission. American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts trained this year to prepare for a joint space mission in 1975. The two crews will meet and join their spacecraft while in orbit around the Earth. Beyond the rescue capability they will demonstrate, it is hoped the complex project will lead to future international cooperative programs.
They have sort of a tacit agreement that we won't blow the whistle on you if you won't blow the whistle on us. Simple. That's what I've often said on radio and television when they say, well, how come the Russians, if they knew that we didn't go to the moon, how come they didn't say anything? Well, it's better that they don't say anything.
It's highly likely that only a few individuals were privy to the whole plan. As with the Manhattan Project, which involved hundreds of thousands of people working across America on the development of the United States atomic bomb, only a relatively small group of scientists were aware of the actual agenda behind the work they were doing, and even fewer masterminds were coordinating the whole program. So in a similar way, this assault on space involved hundreds of thousands of people working towards, in their understanding, a race against the Soviets to reach the moon first.
No doubt when it was understood that it was going to be well nigh impossible to do the job safely with the available technology, only relatively few of the core teams would have been completely in on the alternative plan to fake the public record of the Apollo moon landings. This would become the cover for the surrogate program. Even fewer key individuals would have been in on the reasons behind the top-secret scheme to get out into space at all costs. And with that in mind, we propose that the Soviets and the Americans were at the highest level always working together on this planet's space program, right from the start.
During Project Apollo, 6 highly complex manned craft landed on the moon, took off, and returned to Earth. An 86% success rate. Since Project Apollo, 25 simple, unmanned craft have attempted to fulfill their missions to Mars. Only 7 succeeded. A mere 28% success rate. Was Apollo blessed?
It is just outright unscientific and pathological to accept the moon landing claim given the total lack of confirmation and inability to duplicate anything that even slightly approaches the alleged events of 1969. Of course, by far the greatest mystery in all this is why the scientific community continues to fall for all this and accept it unquestioningly. Is science just another religion that has its sacred cows? If you want to stay in the club, must you defend the beloved cow, no matter how badly it stinks? Since nearly all of academia is dependent on funding from the federal government, any scientist brave enough to speak the truth would be committing career suicide. Scientists realize this, and therefore will not let their minds examine this objectively for even a moment. They all just prefer to run with the herd. As victims of cognitive dissonance, so-called scientists argue in support of the moon landings out of reflex.
Under the Masonic moon, plans were made by the bankers in the back room. Get the president out of the way and hire Stanley Kubrick. Under the Masonic moon, under the Masonic moon, everyone hoped that the boys would come home soon. One more drop from the plane and splash into the ocean. Under the Masonic moon. Von Braun and his conspirators got a free ride to the States. They turned Nazi into Nassau. They just couldn't wait. Under the Masonic moon.
It all started for Stanley Kubrick in late 1963, right before the release of Dr. Strangelove. This Cold War black comedy took the stuffings out of all things that America held sacred. With this one film, Stanley Kubrick rose up to the heights of his filmmaking abilities. And the Pentagon was not happy with Dr. Strangelove and its brutal portrayal of mad, murderous generals and the stumbling bumpkins running the U.S. war machine. In fact, the Pentagon turned Kubrick down when he asked for permission to shoot inside and outside of one of their B-52 bombers. One read of the script of Dr. Strangelove convinced them that this film was going to be dangerous and that Stanley Kubrick might be an agitator artist. The top brass all saw the finished film in early fall of 1963. It was as they expected. The film made fun of the Pentagon, their generals, and their various war plans. But there was something else that struck them about Stanley Kubrick's dark comedy, and that was the scenes both inside and outside the B-52s. Kubrick had pasted together what the interior of a B-52 looked like by taking many separate photos from military magazines and putting them together. The end result was an astonishingly close replica of the actual interior of a B-52. But it was the exterior shot of the B-52 that really excited the boys in the Pentagon. Quaint by today's high-tech special effects standards, Kubrick's exterior shots of the B-52s flying over Russia were absolutely stunning in 1964, especially on the big screen. It was sometime in the fall of 1963 or the winter of 1964 that they contacted Stanley Kubrick and offered him a deal that he could not refuse. It was a deal with the devil in a way, or at least that is how Stanley Kubrick came to view it. By an earnest study of Stanley Kubrick's life, his films, the history of his times, and the understanding of his symbolic system, I intend to show you that Stanley Kubrick was not only a great filmmaker, but that he was privy to the main secrets of an occult society that rules the earth.
Mr. President, I would not rule out the chance to preserve a nucleus of human specimens. It will be quite easy. At the bottom of some of our deeper mine shafts, radioactivity would never penetrate a mine some thousands of feet deep, and in a matter of weeks, sufficient improvements in dwelling space could easily be provided.
How long would you have to stay down there?
Well, that's,
The Pentagon saw Dr. Strangelove, and they knew they had their guy. But for what? It was at that moment that everything would change for Kubrick. If he accepted their offer, he would get anything he wanted. If he declined, they might just get rid of him. In a sense, once the offer was made, Stanley had to take it. And so Stanley Kubrick accepted a deal with the devil, so to speak. It is with this deal and what it would do for Stanley's career that I would like to address in this film. Although what you are about to see may offend you, I ask that you stick with the idea I'm about to present all the way to the end. It may make you uncomfortable, but as Morpheus says in The Matrix, I didn't say it would be easy, I only said it would be the truth. Stanley Kubrick's Odyssey really began in late 1963. His own evolving story would also be our story. Kubrick would reveal much of the truth of our age over the rest of his life. Because of the deal he made, Kubrick was free to make films that would alter the way that we look at ourselves, our history, and our destiny. With this free meal ticket, Kubrick could have gone on to make journeyman films. Instead, he used the medium to reveal the darkest and the lightest aspects of the human condition. So what was the deal that he made in 1963 with the military? That deal was that Stanley Kubrick would film and fake the Apollo moon landings. It has now been 40 years since the fabled moon landings by NASA and the Apollo gang. When it comes to the subject of the moon landings, people tend to fall into two belief groups. First group, by far the bigger of the two groups, accepts the fact that NASA successfully landed on the moon 6 times and that 12 human beings have actually walked on the surface of the moon. The second group, though far smaller, is more vocal about their beliefs. This group says that we never went to the moon and that the entire thing was faked. I would like to present a third position on this issue. This third point of view falls somewhere between these two assertions. This third position postulates that humans did go to the moon, but what we saw on TV and in photographs was completely faked. Furthermore, this third position reveals that Stanley Kubrick is the genius who directed the hoaxed landings. In some ways, NASA's position was understandable. We were in the middle of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Did we really want to show the Russians what we had? In fall 1963, Stanley Kubrick had just finished Dr. Strangelove and was looking to do a science fiction film. Someone in NASA or the Pentagon saw what Kubrick had done in Dr. Strangelove with the B-52s, and admiring his artfulness, designated Kubrick as the person best qualified to direct the Apollo moon landings. If he could do that well on a limited budget, what could he do on an unlimited budget? No one knows how the powers that be convinced Kubrick to direct the Apollo landings. Maybe they had compromised Kubrick in some way. Kubrick also had a reputation for being a notoriously nasty negotiator. It would have been interesting to have been a fly on the wall during the negotiations between Kubrick and the Pentagon. In the end, it looks like Kubrick faked the moon landings in return for two things. The first was a virtually unlimited budget to make his ultimate science fiction film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the second was that he would be able to make any film he wanted, with no oversight from anyone, for the rest of his life. Except for his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, Kubrick got what he wanted. It is uncanny the way that the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey parallels the Apollo program. The film production started in 1964 and went on to the release of 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968. Meanwhile, the Apollo program also began in 1964 and culminated with the first moon landings on July 20th, 1969. It is also very interesting to note that the scientist Frederick Ordway was working both for NASA and the Apollo program and was also Kubrick's top science advisor for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Once he had negotiated the deal, Stanley got to work. The most pressing problem for Kubrick in 1964 was to figure out how to make the shots on the ground, on the surface of the moon, look realistic. He had to make the scenes look wide open and expansive, like it was really done on the moon, and not in some studio backlot. No one knows how many things he tried, but eventually Kubrick settled on doing the entire thing with a cinematic technique called front screen projection. It is in the use of this cinematic technique that the fingerprints of Kubrick can be seen all over the NASA Apollo photographic and video material. But what is front screen projection? Kubrick did not invent the process, but there is no doubt that he perfected it. Front screen projection is a cinematic device that allows scenes to be projected behind the actors so that it appears in the camera as if the actors are moving around on the set provided by the front screen projection. The process came into fruition when the 3M company invented a material called Scotchlite. This was a screen material that was made up of hundreds of thousands of tiny glass beads. These beads were highly reflective. In the front screen projection process, the Scotchlite screen would be placed at the back of the soundstage. The plane of the camera lens and the Scotchlite screen had to be exactly 90 degrees apart. A projector would project the scene onto the Scotchlite screen through a mirror, and the light would go through a beam splitter which would pass the light into the camera. An actor could stand in front of the Scotchlite screen and he would appear to be inside the projection. Today, Hollywood's magicians use green screens and computers for special effects, and so the front screen projection system has gone the way of the adding machine and the Model T. But for its time, especially in the 1960s, nothing worked better than front screen projection for that realistic look that would be needed both for the 8-man scenes in 2001: A Space Odyssey and the faked Apollo moon landings. To see how front screen projection looks on the screen, let's examine the 8-man scenes at the beginning of Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey. One has to remember that the early scenes in 2001 with the actors in ape costumes were all done on a sound stage. None of what you were seeing in the 8-man scenes at the beginning of 2001 was actually shot outside. The scenes that surround the 8 men in 2001 are actually slides of a desert being projected onto the Scotch-Light screen standing at the rear of the set. In order to create these desert backgrounds, Kubrick sent a photographic team to Spain to shoot 8x10 Ektachrome slides. These slides were then projected via the front screen projection system onto the Scotch-Light screen. The actors in ape costumes stood in front of the screen, acting out the script. If you watch 2001 on DVD, you can actually see the seams of the screen, occasionally behind the gyrating apes. Kubrick was doing front screen projection on such a huge and grand fashion that the technicians were forced to sew together many screens of Scotch-Light so that Kubrick could create the vastness needed for the ape scenes to be believable. In this scene, taken from an early scene in 2001, you can see the seams in the blue sky if you look closely. This next image is one that I have processed through a graphics program. In this processing, I have increased the gamma and increased the contrast. Now we can clearly see the seams and the stitching of the Scotch-Light front projection screen in the sky. To get the perspective correct, one has to realize that the Scotch-Light screen is right behind the rocky outcropping set, which was built on a soundstage. The lines on the screen are the flaws in the Scotch-Light screen. These flaws in the screen give the sky a peculiar geometry when the image is properly processed to reveal the front projection Scotch-Light screen. Let's show another example. Here is a scene from the waterhole scene from 2001. This is the same image, but again with the gamma and contrast increased. While watching 2001, with the scenes of the 8 men, one can begin to see the telltale fingerprints that always reveal when the front projection screen system is used. It should be emphasized that the sets that surround the 8 men in the movie are real. Those are real rocks, whether papier-mâché or real, that surround the 8 men. But behind the fabricated rocks on the set, the desert scene is being projected via the front screen projector. One of the ways that you can tell the front screen system is being used is that the bottom horizon line between the actual set and the background Scotch-Light screen has to be blocked. Kubrick strategically located rocks and other things near the bottom of the scene in order to hide the projection screen. In other words, the camera and the viewers would see the bottom of the background projection screen if it were not blocked in some fashion. As part of the trick, it becomes necessary to place things in between the screen and the set to hide the bottom of the screen. I have photoshopped a line differentiating the set and the background Scotch-Light front projection screen. Please note how everything is in focus, from the pebbles on the ground in the set to the desert mountains beyond. You will see that hiding the bottom of the Scotch-Light screen is always being done when the front screen projection system is being used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Hiding the screen is one of the fingerprints. It is evidence of its use. Just like the stage magician who needs the long sleeves of his costume to hide the mechanism of his tricks, so too Kubrick needed to hide the mechanism of his trick behind the carefully placed horizon line between set and screen. Here's another example from 2001. And here is the same image with my Photoshop line separating the set. As you will see before this film is finished, this same fingerprint, this same evidence is clearly seen in all of the NASA Apollo stills and video images. It is this fingerprint that reveals not only that NASA faked the Apollo missions, but how they faked them. Let's examine a few NASA Apollo images now. This is a still from Apollo 17. This is also a great example of the front screen projection process. Again, I have photoshopped a line indicating the back of the set. One can see that there is a slight uprising behind the rover, which is hiding the bottom of the screen. Also notice that even though everything is in focus, from the lunar rover to the mountains in the background, there is a strange change in the landscape of the ground right behind my lines. This is because the photo of the mountains being used on the front projection system has a slightly different ground texture than the set. As we go on, we will see that this fingerprint is also consistent throughout the Apollo images. Here's another Apollo image. Now here is my version where I show the line between the set and the screen. Again, notice the texture of the ground changes right behind my line. Now let's go to some more Apollo images. We can see that the same thing occurs here as in the 8-man scenes in 2001. There is always a line separating the set from the screen. Even if you do not see it at first, it will become apparent as one grows more familiar with the front screen projection process and how it is being used to fake the astronauts standing on the lunar surface. Go to any NASA site like www.apolloarchive.com and start looking for yourself. Not all lunar surface shots are using the process. Sometimes the astronauts are just standing on the set with a completely and suspicious black background. The early missions, Apollo 11 and 12, used the front screen projection system only when they had to. But as the missions went on and they had to look better, Kubrick began to perfect the process. Although you can see the front screen projection process on every mission, the seriously revealing images are in the later missions, particularly Apollo 14, 15, 16, and, my favorite, 17. Here are a few from Apollo 17. The astronaut is driving the lunar rover parallel to the screen, and the rover is only 3 or 4 feet away from the Scotchlight. Please note how the tire treads just lead to nowhere. Actually, they are going to the edge of the set. In this one, the astronaut is about 6 feet in front of the Scotchlight screen. Please note how everything is in focus, from the rocks and pebbles close to the camera all the way to the crystal clear mountain behind the astronaut. As we shall see, even that is impossible. Also, please note the other telltale evidence that permeates the Apollo images. There is a stark difference in the ground texture between the set and what is being projected onto the screen. You can almost count the number of small rocks, and the granularity of the ground is clearly seen on the set. But once we get to the screen on the other side of my line, this granularity disappears. This next image is a slick little piece of work. When first viewed, one is sure that they are looking across the vast, unbroken lunar surface from beginning to end. With the Earth rising, it is truly a stunning shot. But sure enough, close examination reveals the set screen line once again. Again, please note the change in the texture of the ground immediately on each side of the line. The little pebbles and dust just seem to disappear behind my line. Former NASA consultant Richard Hoagland has examined many of the photos of the Apollo landings. Examining the photographic record of the Apollo missions and processing Apollo images through various graphic programs, Hoagland has discovered geometries in the sky surrounding the astronauts on the moon.
Extraordinary. I mean, mind-blowing extraordinary. This is a close-up. We see the hills. We see just hints that something is not quite right in the sky. And when you scan it and simply turn up the gain, turn up the brightness, there, all over the sky, is a stunning set of geometry. Glass-like, semi-transparent, scattering geometry, scattering blue light, which tells us that it must be fine particles, fine stuff, very micron size, with various imperfections, holes, sparkles, the whole 9 yards. This is what Ken caught them painting out in the LRL, because everyone knows you can't see stars from the moon. The bright things were not stars. They were shining bits of glass scattering sunlight, recorded by these primitive, by today's standards, Hasselblad cameras on 35mm Ektachrome film. Starting with this image, we then did sectionals. And we found that as you zoomed in, you got more and more detail in this supposedly black sky above the moon. Remember, it's a vacuum, no atmosphere. There should be nothing here. It should be pitch black. That, again, is why they were painting it out. This all fits together awfully, awfully well, and I use the term awfully with full knowledge. If you look carefully at this section, you'll see now that there is a stunning three-dimensional girder-like geometry, a scaffolding, rebar, a structural matrix standing above the moon, anchored to the surface by a set of slanted buttresses. The geometry is perfect, meaning it absolutely is consistent with what constructional techniques would be there if you had built something miles high above the current surface of the moon. If you look in close-up, you'll see in the buttresses there are layers of detail. This again is, to me, stunning, amazing, stunning quality, because we had not had access to anything approaching this low generation from the Apollo negatives.
He postulates that these geometries are evidence of some kind of gigantic glass-like structures behind, above, and surrounding the astronauts as they stand on the lunar surface. Hoagland even shows us that there are rainbow lights reflecting in the sky high above the astronauts. Many people, especially in NASA, have attacked Hoagland for these interpretations. Yet no matter how much they attack Hoagland, they can never explain what it is that he's finding on these Apollo images. I, like Hoagland, believe that NASA has actually gone to the moon. I believe that moon rocks were taken from the surface of the moon. I believe that there is strong evidence of some kind of past intelligent activity on the surface of the moon. But I do not believe that standard rocket technology is what got mankind from the Earth to the surface of the moon. I'm not trying to debunk Hoagland's discoveries. All I'm trying to do with the following evidence is to show that the Apollo landings are a hoax, and that Stanley Kubrick, using the front screen projection system, directed them. Again, I want to make sure that I'm understood here. I'm not saying that there are not strange structures on the moon. What I'm saying is that the structures and geometries that Richard Hoagland is seeing in the photographs taken on the lunar surface are not what he thinks they are. He believes that these images are proof that NASA is hiding evidence of alien cities. This is a processed photograph of astronaut Ed Mitchell on the surface of the moon, taken during the Apollo 14 mission. Of course, all the stuff in the sky, as seen in this processed Apollo image from Hoagland, is impossible if it was taken on the lunar surface. There is no atmosphere on the moon. Therefore, there can be nothing in the sky. Yet when Hoagland processed much of the Apollo lunar surface imagery, he discovered over and over again all of this crud in the sky above the astronauts. No one in NASA even attempts to answer Hoagland or anyone else about the strange stuff that he and others is finding in the skies above the astronauts. Richard Hoagland theorizes that this is photographic evidence of huge abandoned glass cities on the surface of the moon. He says that what we are seeing in these processed images is huge glass towers that only show up on the images after they've been processed through the graphics software. Hoagland has taken an image on the left and processed it in a manner very similar to how I processed the images from 2001: A Space Odyssey. By increasing the gamma and the contrast of the image, he arrived at the picture on the right. Hoagland interprets the image on the right as proof of giant glass structures behind the astronaut, and for that matter, all over the surface of the moon. What Hoagland is really seeing, though, is the imperfections of the background Scotch-Light screen that Kubrick used to create the lunar backgrounds. These imperfections can also be found in the desert backgrounds in the ape scenes in 2001, as I've shown.
Looking north in the Taurus Littrow, here's supposedly a mountain, here's a bigger mountain. Look at the sky up above, and in the sky you will see this inset, and in the inset there is this incredible rainbow.
What Hoagland in the above image reveals is the texture and geometry of the Scotch-Light screen. Because of the vastness of the set, because he needed it to look like it was not done on a soundstage, Kubrick had to sew several Scotch-Light screens together. It was only when he had created a large enough Scotch-Light screen was he then able to get a large enough background image that would look expansive enough to appear to be the surface of the moon or a desert 4 million years ago. The same process that created the desert backgrounds in 2001 is the same process that created the lunar mountain background for the Apollo missions. This is a picture from Hoagland's research. This processed image reveals a rainbow-like reflecting light high in the sky above the astronauts on the moon. Hoagland theorizes that this is light reflecting off one of the giant glass towers standing right behind the astronaut. What this really is a light reflecting off one of the tiny glass beads of the Scotch-Light screen. For some reason, that particular glass bead was slightly off from its 90-degree angle, and so it caught the projector light and reflected it back into the camera. Again, a scene from 2001. And now one of Hoagland's processed Apollo shots. It is pretty clear that Hoagland's geometries are really the patterns and flaws of the stitches in the Scotch-Light screen.
Furthermore, if you look in the background, here's another one of these amazing glass prismatic dispersions captured behind Schmidt. And the overview is this. Here's the wide angle. There's this incredible color, which cannot exist. It is identical in principle to this. This is a shot of the Golden Gate looking toward the east with the sun setting in the west, ergo the name Golden Gate. This is atmosphere scattering red, green, blue. It's basically the atmosphere acting like a movie screen.
But there's more.
One of the many things that many researchers have discovered about the Apollo footage is that if you slightly speed up the footage of the astronauts walking around on the lunar surface, they appear to be doing their business in normal speed, like they are on Earth. It is apparent that the footage has been shot in slow motion to give the effect of a low-gravity situation. It seems odd that one would move slower in a low-gravity environment because the low gravity would cause even less resistance, not more. In the scenes in 2001, near the beginning, we see the people on the ship and on the lunar surface also moving in a slightly slow-motion manner. Again, this doesn't make a lot of sense in a real-life situation. If anything, they should be moving faster than on Earth because there's less gravity. But showing astronauts moving normally really causes the action to look unreal and staged. So Kubrick decided to shoot the moon scenes both in 2001 and in the Apollo landings in slow motion to make it more convincing. In a way, we were being set up by the film 2001 to accept the odd slow motion in the Apollo scenes. This may have been one of the reasons to release 2001 a year before the Apollo 11 landing. By creating a slow motion environment in 2001, the audience would then accept the slow motion environment being portrayed in the Apollo footage.
There is one thing that I'm sure of. Some part of Stanley Kubrick wanted everyone to know what he had done, and that is why he left behind clues that would explain who did it and how. But also we can see that Kubrick used the faking of the Apollo moon missions as an opportunity to make one great film. Because he had negotiated a deal where no one would be given oversight on the film, Kubrick was allowed to make whatever movie he desired. Knowing that no one would object to his anti-Hollywood methods, he created the first abstract feature film, the first intellectual movie, and the greatest work of art in the 20th century. And I'm talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey. Outside of the front screen projection evidence, which I believe nails the fraud of the Apollo landings, there is other circumstantial evidence that forces the conclusion even more in the direction of Kubrick directing the entire Apollo missions. For instance, in the original release of 2001, there were many credits thanking NASA and many of the aerospace companies that worked with NASA on the moon landings. These credits have long been removed from all subsequent releases of 2001. For those of us old enough to remember, in the original credits, Kubrick thanks a vast array of military and space corporations for their help in the production. Are these the same corporations that supposedly helped NASA get the astronauts to the moon? One has to wonder, what kind of help did they give Stanley, and for what price? film Wag the Dog, Dustin Hoffman plays a movie producer hired by the CIA to fake an event. His name in the movie is Stanley. In that movie, Stanley mysteriously dies after telling everyone that he wants to take credit for the event that he helped to fake. Stanley Kubrick died 4 days after showing Eyes Wide Shut to the executives at Warner Brothers. It is rumored that they were very upset concerning the film. They wanted Kubrick to re-edit the film, but he refused. I personally was in France when Kubrick died and saw on French television outtakes from several scenes that were never in the finished film. And finally, Eyes Wide Shut was released on July 16, 1999. Stanley Kubrick insisted in his contract that this be the date of the release. July 16, 1999 is exactly 30 years to the day that Apollo 11 was launched.
May I have the password, please?
Fidelio.
That's right, sir. That is the password for admittance. But may I ask, what is the password for the house?
The password for the house.
Yes?
I'm sorry.
Kubrick faking the Apollo moon landing for NASA is really outrageous, and surely someone would have talked, someone would have said something. You would think that Kubrick would have told somebody something. And of course, we know he never did. Or did he? And that's where I'm going to go next, because I'm going to show you that in fact Kubrick made a film which described the ordeal of faking the Apollo moon landing. Because overtly explaining that he was involved in the faking of the Apollo moon landings would probably cost him his life, Stanley chose a vehicle to describe what he went through to fake the Apollo moon landings. And I'm about to show you that that vehicle was the film The Shining. The Shining is surely Stanley Kubrick's most misunderstood masterpiece. I use the word masterpiece guardedly because I've never really thought that The Shining was a very good film. At the time, in 1980, when I first saw it, I didn't like it at all. The way that Kubrick threw out so much of Stephen King's great source material and replaced it with a lot of things that just didn't seem to make any sense really bothered me. Hopefully, before I'm finished here, you will see that it is only when Kubrick dramatically alters the script from Stephen King's novel that we can begin to understand what Stanley Kubrick is trying to tell us in his version of The Shining. It should be understood from the beginning that The Shining is Stanley Kubrick's most personal film, outside of possibly Eyes Wide Shut. Before we are done here, it will be easy to see that Stanley Kubrick was only using Stephen King's novel as a launching pad, excuse the pun, to be able to tell us a completely different story under the guise of making a film based on a best-selling novel. He did this for a very important reason, mainly to save his life. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. In fact, let's start at the beginning. There are two main characters in the film, Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson, and his son Danny, played by Danny Lloyd. It is important to understand here that Jack and Danny are two aspects of Stanley Kubrick himself. Jack is the practical, pragmatic guy who wants to be a great artist, and he's apparently willing to do anything to accomplish his goal of being an artist, a writer in this case. Jack, like Stanley, has black hair, he is idiosyncratic, and he even smokes the same cigarettes as Stanley, Marlboro. Danny is the other side of the great director. He is the childlike Kubrick. It is Danny who is the real artist. The Danny side of Kubrick is psychic, youthful, and sees things that no one else sees. Danny has a tendency to tell people things that should have been kept quiet. The opening of the film takes place with us witnessing Stanley's pragmatic side, Jack, cutting a deal with the manager of the Overlook Hotel. The deal between Jack and the manager of the Overlook is that Jack can write, that is, create, all that he wants as long as he takes care of the Overlook. One other important point is that the manager of the Overlook tells Jack that the previous caretaker went crazy from the stress of the job and killed his wife and 2 girls. The manager of the Overlook Hotel, played by Barry Nelson, is wearing red, white, and blue. Jack's wife Wendy, played by Shelley Duvall, and his son Danny also wear red, white, and blue for almost the entire first hour of the film.
Yeah, I guess so. What about Tony? He's looking forward to the hotel, I bet. It's a torch. Now, come on, Tony. Don't be silly. I don't want to go there, Mrs. Torch. Well, how come you don't want to go? I just don't.
In this symbolic interpretation, the Overlook Hotel is America. It was built, just like the manager says, on the graves of Indians. Even when walking on the floor of the Overlook Hotel, one finds themselves trampling over various Native American symbols. The Overlook Hotel is America. Like America, the Overlook Hotel is new and shiny. It is ostentatious, corny, and architecturally boring. As the manager tells Wendy, all of the best people stayed here.
Lots of movie stars.
Royalty?
All the best people.
But there is something very deep happening. Kubrick brushed shoulders with the elite of the world. He knows what's going on, and he's using this movie to tell us. We begin to understand Kubrick's story from his use of symbols. As I like to say, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a symbol is worth 1,000 pictures. For it will be through the use of symbol that the real story of The Shining can be revealed. Barry Nelson, who plays the manager of the Overlook, while interviewing Jack, has an American eagle right behind his head. It is as if the eagle is the power behind the manager. Not only is the eagle the symbol of America, but it should be noted that the lunar lander of the Apollo 11 mission was called the Eagle. To the manager's left on the desk is an American flag. Symbolically, the manager is the face of the government of the United States. Jack has cut this deal with the government to be the caretaker of the hotel. It should be noted that Barry Nelson is wearing a toupee, which makes him look suspiciously like John F. Kennedy. The manager tells Jack that his main job is to prevent the Overlook Hotel, that is America, from appearing like it is decaying. The manager reiterates that this is Jack's primary responsibility.
It's not a very demanding job. The only thing that can get a bit trying up here during the winter is a tremendous sense of isolation.
On their first day in the hotel, Danny has a vision of the previous caretaker's daughters, and he sees that they are twins. The previous caretaker's daughters were not twins in the Stephen King novel. This discrepancy between the book and the film will grow in importance as we continue. Jack, Danny, and Wendy also meet Dick Halloran, who is the cook for the Overlook. He befriends Danny, and it is through him that Danny discovers that he is not alone when it comes to psychic ability. Dick warns Danny to stay away from room 237. Jack, Wendy, and Danny have now fully moved into the hotel. There's a long, cold winter ahead of them. At first, Jack loves the hotel, but he is having problems with his writing. Also, he cannot sleep. Meanwhile, Wendy and Danny are having fun. Jack is not writing. Instead, he is throwing a tennis ball at the wall in the room where his typewriter sits. On the wall, which is being struck by the tennis ball, is a Native American artistic motif that looks suspiciously like a group of rockets about to be launched. Finally, Jack throws the ball away and it disappears into the darkness of the hotel. Jack walks over and looks down at the model of the maze which sits outside the hotel. He sees Wendy and Danny caught in the middle of the maze, totally unaware of the nature of the deal that he has cut with the Overlook. When Shelley Duvall and Danny are running towards the maze, Shelley says, "The loser has to keep America clean."
Loser has to keep America clean.
Remember, Jack's job is to keep the Overlook looking like it's new, even though it's not. The Overlook is America. The loser has to keep America clean. A cold winter storm has now blown over the hotel. The storm is a symbol of the Cold War between Russia and the United States. Of course, the Cold War is also one of the driving forces for the entire reason for faking the moon landings. We were living in a very dangerous world, and it was shrewd to hide our advanced technology from the Russians. This is one of the reasons for the bears that are seen all over The Shining. The Russian bear, in its competition for the race to the moon, was a driving force behind having to fake the Apollo moon landings. Jack, his family, and the Overlook Hotel are trapped in the cold, just as America was trapped in the Cold War with Russia. The stuffed bears seen throughout the film are symbolically representing the Soviet Union's empire, but there are other explanations for these bears, and we'll get to them later. Symbolically, the bears seen through the film are also the representation of the pressure that the Russians put on the USA to get to the moon.
Because he hides. Where does he go? In my stomach. Does Tony ever tell you to do things? I don't want to talk about Tony anymore.
Danny is racing his tricycle down the hallways of the Overlook. Suddenly he stops and sees the twin girls at the end of the hallway. In unison they say to Danny, "Come play with us, Danny, forever and ever."
Come play with us, Danny. Forever and ever and ever.
At this point in the film, we graphically discover the nature of the deal that Jack really has cut with the manager of the Overlook. It is the most crucial scene in the film. Danny is in a hallway playing with his trucks. Please note that the carpet has these strange hexagonal patterns in them with a long line in front of the hexagonal pattern. Now look at these pictures of launch pad 39 at Cape Canaveral and see that their launch pads look very similar to the patterns on the carpet that Danny is playing on. Also please note that Danny is playing with trucks, and it looks almost as if the trucks and everything are on the launch pad surrounding the rocket. But where is the rocket? Suddenly out of nowhere, the Overlook Hotel rolls the tennis ball from nowhere, the tennis ball that Jack lost earlier. It is a gesture, and the gesture says, "Want to play?" Mystified by where the ball came from, Danny stands up, and the audience finally sees what the nature of the secret project is really about. As Danny stands up, the answer is revealed in an instant. Danny is wearing a sweater with a crudely sewn rocket pictured on the front. Above the rocket, clearly seen on Danny's sweater, are the words, Apollo 11. The audience watching the film literally sees the launch of Apollo 11 right before their eyes as Danny rises up from the floor. It isn't the real launch of Apollo 11. It is, of course, the symbolic launching of Apollo 11. In other words, it isn't real. What happens next is crucial to understanding everything else that happens in this film. Danny, bewildered, walks down the hallway. He sees that room 237, the room that Halloran warned him about, has a key in the lock and the door is wide open. It is important to note that the room in question was number 217 in the Stephen King version of The Shining. For reasons unknown, Kubrick changed it to 237. Those unknown reasons are about to become known. Danny is literally carrying a symbolic Apollo 11 on his body via the sweater to the moon as he walks over to room 237. Why do I think this? Because the average distance from the Earth to the moon is 237,000 miles. Now some people may argue with this and say that it's actually 238,000 miles and change. The moon is in a slightly elliptical orbit which means sometimes the moon is much further away from the Earth than in other times. If you do the math and you figure it out, you can see that the true distance that the moon is from the Earth is 237,000 miles. Even more important to this argument, at the time that Kubrick faked the Apollo moon landings, it was common knowledge in the textbooks and the scientific work that the moon was 237,000 miles away from the Earth. This is the figure that Stanley was working with, and that is why he changed the room from 217 to 237. The real truth is that this movie is really about the deal that Stanley Kubrick made with the manager of the Overlook Hotel, America. This deal was to get Stanley to recreate, in other words, to fake the Apollo moon landings. Danny represents the artistic side of Kubrick. Because of the complexity of the artistic realization of the manner in which the lunar landings needed to appear, Kubrick needed to trust his artistic side. Room 237 represents the fake lunar set that Stanley had to create to make the lunar landings appear factual. But really, on this set and in this room, nothing is real. As the film will soon reveal, Room 237 has to be lied about. It cannot be understood at all, ever. Nothing real ever happens in Room 237. When Danny opens up the door to Room 237, we see the tag attached to the key. And if you just look at the capital letters on the tag, you can see that it says room, R-O-O-M, and then N, and there's a small O. If we discard the small O, we're left with R-O-O-M and N. You can actually get two words out of it. And those two words are moon room. So here we have the tag attached to the key. It's in the door in room 237, and the letters on the tag come out to say moon room. Is this what Stanley called the lunar set? In the next scene, Jack has a bad dream while he is working. He tells Wendy that in his dream he has killed Wendy and Danny.
I killed you and Danny. But I didn't just kill you. Cut you up into little pieces. Oh, my God. I must be...
Meanwhile, Danny enters the scene, and it is obvious that some mysterious force has physically hurt Danny. This mysterious force has also torn his Apollo 11 sweater. Wendy, horrified, thinks that Jack did it. And in a way she is right, because Danny got hurt because of the deal that Jack cut. Frustrated, Jack goes to the bar located in the Gold Room. Obviously stressed, Jack whispers to no one that he would sell his soul for a drink. It is then that Jack meets the real manager of the Overlook Hotel. A mysterious man suddenly appears behind the bar. His name is Lloyd, and he is the bartender of the Overlook Hotel. Clearly, Stanley Kubrick shows Lloyd in a satanic light. Lloyd seduces Jack with a drink. Jack has sold his soul to the project, to being the caretaker of the Overlook. Jack and Lloyd's conversation is interrupted by Wendy's entrance. Lloyd and Jack's glass of scotch suddenly disappear. Wendy tells Jack that someone else is in the hotel. She tells him that Danny was hurt by someone who's inside room 237. Jack then goes to room 237, and he sees the manifestation of a young woman into an old woman. I believe this scene occurs because at first Kubrick thought that directing the Apollo 11 and later moon landings was going to be a sexy job. But once he started in on the project and had to deal with the minutiae of trying to fake the Apollo moon landings day after day, quickly the sexy woman turns into an old hag. So the Apollo moon landing started out as a sexy project for Stanley, but soon it turned into the equivalent of kissing an old lady. Because room 237 is symbolic of the lunar set for Apollo 11, Jack has to lie to Wendy about what is going on in the room. He tells her that nothing is going on in room 237. It is apparent that Danny must have hurt himself.
What about those bruises on his neck? Somebody did that to him.
I think he did it to himself.
That's not possible.
Once you rule out his version of what happened, There is no other explanation, is there?
Now that Jack has lied to his wife, he is able to see all of the spirits of the Overlook. Some of the best people stayed here. The secret group that rules the Overlook can finally be seen by Jack, Kubrick. He has been let into their posh society.
Hi, Lloyd. Been away. Now I'm back. Good evening, Mr. Torrance. It's good to see you. It's good to be back, Lloyd. What'll it be, sir? Hair of the dog that bit me. Bourbon on the rocks. That'll do it. No charge to you, Mr. Torrance. No charge? Your money's no good here. Orders from the house. Orders from the house. Drink up, Mr. Torrance. I'm the kind of man likes to know who's buying their drinks, Lloyd. It's not a matter that concerns you, Mr. Torrance. At least not at this point. Anything you say, Lloyd. Anything you say.
But at the party of rich people, Jack gets a drink spilled on him by the waiter, who turns out to be the previous caretaker who killed his twin daughters. In this we discover something profound. Although it looks like he, Jack, has been accepted into the secret high society, he is still just a servant. Jack will end up as a waiter or a janitor, just like Grady, the previous caretaker, has ended up as a waiter. But Mr. Grady, who denies that he was the previous caretaker, tells Jack that Danny is informing someone about the secret Apollo hoax.
I'm sorry to differ with you, sir. But you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here. Did you know, Mr. Torrance, that your son is attempting to bring an outside party into this situation? Did you know that?
After this, Jack begins to go to hell physically. He starts growing an unkempt beard and stops combing his hair. Two things that Stanley Kubrick was known for doing, or not doing, himself. Now Jack is looking a lot like Stanley Kubrick, especially as he began to appear under the stress of the twin productions going on at once. 1, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and 2, faking the Apollo 11 landings. It should also be noted that Jack and Stanley are about the same age and they have the same hair color. Early 2001: A Space Odyssey production photos show a youthful and unbearded Kubrick with combed hair, looking quite handsome. But photos taken 4 years later, near the end of the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey, show that Kubrick was a physical wreck. The de-evolution of Stanley Kubrick's appearance during the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey is disturbingly close to Jack Nicholson's appearance in The Shining. Despite his disheveled appearance, Jack has started writing again. Wendy, who is really supposed to be Kubrick's wife Christiana, wants to read the book that Jack is working so furiously on.
Jack angrily tears out the sheet of paper from his typewriter in order to prevent Wendy from seeing it.
She asks to see what he is writing. Jack is surprised by her entrance into the room where he does his writing. Angrily, he rejects her. He tells her to stay out of the room where he is writing.
Come on, hon. Don't be so grouchy.
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later on with a couple of sandwiches for you, and maybe you'll let me read something then.
Wendy, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah?
Fine. And we're gonna make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, you hear me typing. Whether you don't hear me typing, what the fuck you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means that I am working. That means don't come in. How do you think you can handle that?
Yeah.
Fine. Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
After he is done telling her to stay out of the room, he goes back to the typewriter. But now it has somehow put a new page into the typewriter. Jack is not surprised that the typewriter has a new page in it and goes back to writing. Is this a continuity error? Hardly. Kubrick is clearly showing us that whatever Jack is writing must be hidden from his wife. But more importantly, he is saying that the Overlook Hotel itself, that is America, which is feeding the paper into Jack's typewriter. Kubrick succinctly shows us that it is not Jack who is in charge of this thing. It is the Overlook.
It is clear that Wendy, Kubrick's wife, is not allowed to know anything about the project. But what is this book that Jack is writing? Wendy soon finds out what is in the book that Jack is working on. It is then that we get the clincher that proves that this point of view is the correct interpretation of Kubrick's The Shining. Wendy sneaks into Jack's writing room. Slowly she begins to read the book that Jack has been working on. Now this scene is totally original to the movie. It is not in the King novel. Although it is mildly terrifying, it's not that horrific. Yet it is the centerpiece of the film and arguably the scariest scene in the movie. Why? Because every single one of the hundreds of pages that Jack has been furiously writing is a variation of only one sentence. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Incredibly, every page has this exact sentence and is written over and over. Truly, it is scary enough to think that Jack has been sitting there day after day, writing the same sentence over and over. Wendy's face reveals her fear over this discovery. What does it all mean? May I humbly suggest that the word all in this repeated sentence actually stands for A11, that is Apollo 11. A11 work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. May I suggest that the nickname or code name for the faking of the Apollo moon missions was A11. Accepting that this is true, we can see what Stanley is really telling us. Apollo 11 work and no play makes Jack, Kubrick, a dull boy. If you think that I'm stretching things here, I would like to point out the patch that NASA had created to symbolize the Apollo program. There are other A's in the film also. The Overlook Hotel has several A's built into its construction when viewed from the outside. Stanley has used these A's before. Here is the cover of A Clockwork Orange, with Alex menacingly coming out of the A with his all-seeing eye cufflink. It is clear that the evidence presented in the film that Kubrick's wife, Shelley Duvall, had discovered that he, Stanley Kubrick, had made a secret deal with the manager of the Overlook, i.e. with the rulers of the USA. Shelley Duvall, i.e. Christiana Kubrick, also discovered that what she thought was one thing actually turned out to be another. What Mrs. Kubrick discovered was that instead of making a science fiction film called 2001: A Space Odyssey, her husband was really working to create the fake Apollo moon landings. At this point, the film gets really interesting. Frightened by this revelation, Wendy wants Jack, Stanley, to quit the project. Jack, Stanley, angrily replies, "That is so typical of you. I've made an agreement. I have obligations to my employers." Jack looks at her and says, "Do you have any idea what would happen to my future if I failed to live up to my responsibility?"
You concerned about me?
Of course I am.
Of course you are. Ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Dick, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me, and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract, in which I have accepted that responsibility? Do you have the slightest idea what a moral and ethical principle is, do you? Has it ever occurred to you what would happen to my future if I were to fail to live up to my responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you?
Danny uses his gift of the Shining to contact Dick Halloran in Florida, which I might add is where Apollo 11 was launched. Dick laboriously travels from Florida to Colorado.
Pardon me, miss. What time will we get to Denver?
We're due to arrive at 8:20, sir.
Thank you very much.
In King's novel, Jack has a red Volkswagen, but Kubrick changed it to a yellow Volkswagen in the film. When Halloran is driving to the Overlook in the snowstorm, he sees a red Volkswagen completely wrecked by a semi-truck. This is a cold-hearted message directly from Stanley Kubrick to Stephen King, that his vehicle, the novel The Shining, has been wrecked by Kubrick and replaced with Kubrick's version. I really have to wonder what Stephen King thought of Kubrick's film when he saw this scene, especially since he was probably the only one in the world who understood Stanley's message. In another abrupt break with the novel, Jack Torrance kills Halloran as soon as he arrives at the Overlook. So much for Halloran's psychic abilities. Well, I think this scene is very disturbing, and I doubt if I can ever prove this, but I think Stanley Kubrick is telling us something very definite with this alteration to the King novel. I believe that the naive side of him, represented by Danny, told someone that he, Kubrick, was faking the Apollo moon landings. He may have even told this person that he was faking the lunar landings for NASA while appearing to produce the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Halloran is a representation of the person that Kubrick mistakenly revealed this most secret of all information. When Halloran and Danny have a conversation about The Shining, Halloran warns Danny to stay away from room 237. He says, "You ain't got no business going to room 237, so just stay out." As Halloran is the only person to warn Danny, Stanley, about room 237, the moon landing stage, Stanley went to this mysterious confidant and told him that he was right. Stanley should have stayed away from room 237, the moon landing stage. Because of that, Halloran, or the person who Stanley told, had to die. The secret must remain safe.
You're scared of room 237, ain't you?
No, I ain't.
Mr. Halloran, what is in room 237?
Nothing. There ain't nothing in room 237. But you ain't got no business going in there anyway. So stay out.
This also explains why Kubrick had to hide all of this crucial information inside the construct of the King novel. Kubrick wanted the story to get out, but he was also afraid for his life. Kubrick had to fake the making of the Stephen King novel so that he could reveal that he was involved in faking the moon landings. The truth is that The Shining is the story of how Stanley Kubrick cut a deal with the U.S. government to fake the Apollo moon landings. It is also the story of how Kubrick may have accidentally told someone what he had done and how that person had to be killed. The Shining is also the story of how faking the moon landings almost sacrificed his relationship with his wife. Finally, it is the story of how Stanley Kubrick barely escaped alive. The Shining is the story of how a part of Stanley Kubrick was killed by the agreement that he made with the U.S. government to become the caretaker of a project called A11, or Apollo 11. It is also the history of NASA. This explains why the previous caretaker was so pressured and stressed that he had to kill his twin daughters. Why? Because the previous NASA missions before Apollo were named Gemini. The Gemini are twins. This is why Kubrick switched the girls from just being sisters to being twins. At 1 hour and 55 minutes into the film, Jack wakes up in the pantry surrounded by boxes that say 39,000. Apollo 11 took off from launch pad 39. Other boxes say Golden Ray, which is what comes from Apollo, the sun god. Finally, we see Tang, the drink that went to the moon with the astronauts. And finally, the ending shot of The Shining has Jack at a 4th of July party in 1921. In his right hand, he is holding a secret note. There is also a gentleman behind Jack who is trying to stop him from showing us this secret note. What is in this secret note? You have just found out.
Under the Masonic moon, plans were made by the bankers in the back room. Get the president out of the way. Under the Masonic moon, plans were made by the bankers in the back room. The owl sees into the night, and the secret will never be